3 half-frozen wild horses showed up at a lonely farmer's gate, begging for shelter. What he discovered next would change everything. On the coldest morning of the year, a lonely Montana farmer opened his door and saw something he would never forget. 3 wild horses, shaking, starving, and staring straight at him as if he was their last hope. He had no idea that letting them in would pull him into a story of danger, redemption, and a family fighting to survive the winter. The wind had a strange way of carrying silence across Paradise Valley, stretching it thin, pulling it over the land until every fence post and pine branch seemed wrapped in a quilt of white hush. Ethan Cole stepped out onto the porch of his farmhouse, boots crunching into a layer of new snow that had fallen overnight. The storm had not yet broken, only paused, as if catching its breath before returning with its full weight. His old dog, Bo, trailed behind him, sniffing the air with the caution of an animal that had survived more winters than it wished to count. Ethan scanned the pale horizon while adjusting the worn collar of his canvas coat. The day had the kind of quiet that made a man think of unfinished letters, unspoken apologies, and the parts of himself he'd buried beneath work and cold. He tossed grain into the feeders for the cattle, listened to the soft rustle as they gathered, and then, just as he turned back toward the house, Bo growled. A low, uncertain rumble. The kind a dog makes when he's not sure whether he's seen a ghost or a memory. Ethan followed the dog's gaze. At first it was nothing, just the swirling white drifting sideways like loose pages torn from a notebook. But then the snow shifted, pulled apart by 2 shaking silhouettes. Shadows, moving slowly, haltingly, as if each step cost more than the creatures taking them could afford. 2 horses emerged from the veil of white, their coats crusted with frost, their ribs faintly visible beneath winter-thinned hides. They looked like they'd been carved from the storm itself, sculptures that had somehow found the breath to move. The mare lifted her head first. Large, dark eyes locked onto Ethan with a depth that made him catch his breath. There was no wild defiance in them. Only exhaustion, a plea held tight in the quiet between heartbeats. Beside her, a smaller horse, barely more than a yearling, stumbled, legs trembling violently before catching itself just in time. Ethan's throat tightened. He knew that sort of trembling. He had seen it before, in animals pushed beyond their limit and in people who had walked too close to grief. Snow spiraled around them, gusting between human and horse, like a question neither side knew how to ask. Ethan took a slow step forward. The mare did not retreat. She simply watched, studied him, as if weighing whether this man, alone in a valley built of wind and regrets, was someone she could trust. Bo's growl softened into a whine, and that gentle sound seemed to tip the world ever so slightly. Ethan felt something shift inside him, something he had kept locked away since the accident that had torn him from the life he once knew. The cold bit into his face, but he barely noticed. He could feel the quiet plea hanging in the air between them. Please, do something. He whispered to no one in particular. What on earth brought you here? His voice sounded unfamiliar, as though he hadn't used it to speak to another living soul in days. The horses said nothing, yet their stillness, their shivering, their fragile courage carried a weight heavier than words. Ethan reached the fence line, gloved hands gripping the frozen wood. The mare took a tiny step closer, and for a breath, the world seemed to pause, storm, wind, and time itself. She lowered her head, almost imperceptibly, as if offering a part of herself to his decision. And in that delicate, trembling gesture, Ethan felt something inside his rib cage bend, then crack open the way ice breaks on a spring river. He looked at the latch, the old metal warped from years of weather, and felt how cold it was beneath his fingers. A familiar ache pulsed behind his ribs, the echo of a memory he'd spent years trying to outrun. But the mare shivered again, violent enough that her hooves scraped against the frozen ground, and the yearling gave a thin, broken whinny, more breath than sound, the kind that wrapped around a man's heart and squeezed. Ethan exhaled hard, a ghost of warmth in the winter air. "All right," he murmured, voice cracking softly. "All right." His hand tightened around the latch. The metal groaned. Even Bo fell silent. And as Ethan pulled open the gate, letting the storm's breath spill through the gap, he sensed, deep in the place where fear and hope share the same fragile bones, that this single motion would reshape the days ahead in ways he could not yet understand. The two wild horses stood before him, waiting, not as creatures of instinct, but as survivors who had chosen him. And when they crossed the threshold into his world of weathered fences and old grief, Ethan felt the air change around him, thin and trembling, like the beginning of something he had not dared to feel in years. The storm closed in again, swallowing the horizon in a swirl of white, but Ethan no longer felt alone in the valley. Not with these two shadows standing beside him, breathing hard, carrying secrets he was about to uncover, secrets far deeper than anything the winter had ever buried. For a heartbeat after the gate swung open, nothing moved. The mare stood with one front hoof half raised, as if frozen mid-step, snow clinging to the long hairs above her fetlock. Then she blew out a breath that came in a sharp, visible burst and walked past Ethan like someone crossing a border they knew they could never return from. The younger horse hesitated, muscles trembling, then limped after her, brushing so close to Ethan that the damp chill of its coat seeped through his jacket sleeve. He closed the gate behind them, the old hinges protesting with a rusty squeal. The sound echoed faintly across the empty pasture before being swallowed by the storm. Inside the small paddock, the world felt different, less like open wilderness, more like a room where every decision would be noticed. Bo trotted along the fence line, tail held low, nose working the air, unsure what to make of these new arrivals. "Easy," Ethan murmured, not sure if he was talking to the horses, the dog, or himself. He led the way toward the old barn that backed up to the windbreak of cottonwoods. The structure had been there longer than he'd been alive. His father once said you could read the years in its wood the way doctors read a chart. Planks bowed inward, roof patched with mismatched tin. But it was still standing. And tonight, that made it worth more than any shiny new building an online banking app or mortgage rates brochure had ever promised him. The mare followed, head low, ears flicking forward and back. The yearling limped badly now, every step a negotiation. Ethan slowed his pace, letting them choose the distance, leaving space enough that they could turn away if instinct screamed louder than exhaustion. They didn't. When he slid the barn door aside, a spill of warmer air floated out. Faint hay, old leather, the sweet, dry scent of wood that had known summers. He grabbed a lantern from its hook and thumbed the striker. The tiny flame grew, spilled light across the worn floorboards and the empty stall that hadn't housed a horse in years. The mare stopped at the threshold, eyes wide as the lantern glow caught them. For a second, Ethan saw his own reflection in those dark orbs, a pale man in a fraying coat, looking more like a caretaker of ghosts than of land. "Come on, girl," he said softly. "This is as good as it gets around here." It wasn't much of a line, but his voice carried something gentle that the mare seemed to recognize. She stepped inside. Her hooves made a hollow sound on the wood, followed by the uneven clop scrape of the yearling. As the door slid shut behind them, the storm dulled to a muffled roar, like ocean waves heard from a distance. Up close, the damage told its story. Their coats were patchy, hair clumped from melted frost, ribs faintly visible under winter weight loss. But it wasn't the thinness that made Ethan's jaw tighten. It was the marks. A rubbed patch along the mare's neck, where hair gave way to bare skin, pinkish and rough. A faint, hard ring beneath it, like the ghost of a rope that had bitten too tight for too long. On the yearling, just behind the jawline, another rubbed groove, as if something had slipped there and jerked more than once. He swallowed. There were many ways a horse could come to harm in a place like this. Wire, fallen branches, slick rock. But these weren't the random scrapes of bad luck. These were circles, intentional. He reached out slowly, letting the mare sniff his glove first. Her breath was hot on his knuckles. When he brushed aside her damp mane, she flinched, but didn't pull away. The skin was warm, tender. He could almost see it. A lariat arcing through the air, tightening around that strong neck, the sudden panic, the desperate fight against something that wouldn't let go. He'd thrown ropes in his younger days, catching calves that bawled and fought. But he'd never liked how a bad throw could turn into a bruise that lasted longer than the job. Bo whined softly behind him, nails ticking on the boards. Ethan let the mare's mane fall back into place and turned his attention to the younger horse. Its back leg was swollen at the joint, warmth radiating through the skin like a low fever. He pressed lightly with his fingertips, feeling the animal's muscles twitch beneath his hand. The yearling's breath hitched, but it didn't lash out. It simply watched him, eyes glassy with fatigue, but alert, questioning. "Yeah," Ethan whispered. "I see it." He straightened, joints popping in quiet protest. For a moment his gaze drifted upward, toward the loft where bales of hay sat in neat rows his father would have approved of. This barn had once held a different sound, the rhythm of hooves, the jingle of harness, the low murmur of his father's voice talking to horses like they were neighbors instead of property. And then had come that one winter afternoon, the new sleigh, the icy patch on the hill, Daisy's panicked slide, and the sickening crash that followed. He could still hear the way the world had gone silent afterward. No wind, no birds, just the crack of splintered wood and the labored breathing of a mare whose body wouldn't obey her anymore. He'd knelt beside her, palms flat against her neck, feeling the life tremble beneath his skin and fade in increments, like a radio signal drifting out of range. The vet had come, too late. His father had stood a few feet away, jaw tight, eyes a storm Ethan couldn't look at. "Should never have hitched her in this weather," his father had said, not shouting, which somehow made it worse. Those words had planted themselves in Ethan's chest, taken root, and they were still there long after his father was gone, long after the last piece of the sleigh had rotted out behind the barn. Now here he was, in another winter, hands on another horse that might have only one more bad break left in it. The thought scraped hard against the part of him that tried to keep life simple. Fix fences, pay the bills, worry about home insurance and pasture leases, and the next delivery of feed. There were times he sat at the kitchen table staring at letters from the bank, thinking more about car insurance renewals and credit card interest than anything living outside the window. Numbers, due dates, polite threats in printed ink. Those were the things that pressed on his brain. They were cold, predictable, easier to face than the warm, uncertain pulse beneath his hand right now. Ethan exhaled and moved quickly before doubt could drag at his heels. He fetched a couple of old wool blankets from a storage trunk, shook the dust from them, and draped one over the mare's back. The other he folded and eased across the yearling's hindquarters, taking care not to put pressure on the swollen leg. Steam rose faintly where the fabric met their chilled bodies. He dug out the battered metal first aid box he kept for the cattle. A mixture of bandages, antiseptic, and a small tube of ointment left over from the last time Jed's gelding had torn itself on a fence. Kneeling beside the yearling, Ethan worked in silence, hands moving with the muscle memory of a man who had done this 100 times in another life. The smell of medicine mixed with hay and damp horse, an oddly comforting blend. The mare hovered nearby, head lowered, nostrils flaring each time he adjusted the bandage. Once, when he tightened the wrap a little too much, and the yearling flinched. She stepped forward, pressing her chest lightly against his shoulder. It wasn't a shove, more like a warning tap. Careful. I'm trying, he said quietly. When he was done, his fingers numb and clumsy from the cold, he sat back on his heels and just watched them. The lantern flickered, light catching in the mare's eyes like small, distant stars. The storm outside had settled into a steady rush against the barn walls, a sound that might have been calming if not for the knowledge of how thin those walls really were. A truck's distant rumble passed along the county road, muffled by snow. It made Ethan think of his neighbor, Jed, and the half-serious warnings the man had tossed over coffee a few weeks back, about strange trailers seen hauling out of the valley late at night, drivers who weren't local ranchers, folks looking to turn wild horses into quiet profit if no one was watching. Ethan hadn't wanted to listen then. Trouble felt like something you could avoid if you just kept your head down. But now there were 2 pairs of eyes in his barn that said otherwise. Trouble had already found them. Bo circled once and lay down near the stall door, front paws crossed, eyes fixed on the horses as if he'd appointed himself night watchman. Ethan rose slowly, his legs stiff, and hung the lantern higher on its hook. Shadows shifted along the rafters, turning the barn into a dim cathedral of wood and breath. "You picked a hell of a place to knock on," he told the mare, his voice barely louder than the wind. "This gate, it was supposed to stay closed." She blinked at him, an almost imperceptible gesture, then lowered her head toward the yearling, her muzzle brushing the youngster's neck in a slow, reassuring stroke. The yearling sighed and finally let its eyes close, body sinking a fraction deeper into the straw. Ethan leaned back against the stall wall, feeling the rough wood bite through his coat. His pulse had finally slowed, but he knew this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of something he didn't yet have a name for. He looked at the marks on their skin, the bandage wrapped around the fragile leg, the blankets trying to hold in their fading warmth. He thought of rope burns and dark trailers, of men who saw these animals as walking dollar signs rather than living stories. He thought of bills and deadlines and the simple, selfish ease of pretending he hadn't seen any of this. Outside, the valley waited under its shroud of snow. Inside, against every quiet instinct he'd sharpened over the years, Ethan Cole had taken in 2 wild horses that didn't belong to him, and problems that definitely didn't. And as he stood there listening to their breathing settle into a shaky rhythm, he understood, with a clarity that made his chest ache, that the gate he'd opened tonight wasn't just made of wood and rusted hinges. It was the one he'd kept shut around his own life for a very long time. He turned down the lantern just a notch, leaving enough light for them to see one another, and whispered, "We'll figure this out tomorrow." But tomorrow was already on its way, riding in on the slow roll of tires over snow and the faint crackle of a radio signal, searching through the winter air for a man who had just, without quite meaning to, stepped into the middle of something much bigger than his little farm and his quiet grief. Morning came without sunlight. It seeped into the barn the way cold seeps into bone, quietly, insistently, until the whole place felt washed in a gray that made every breath look heavier than it was. Ethan had dozed against the stall wall, boots stretched toward the fading heat of the lantern, while Bo slept curled beneath his knees. The mare stood exactly where she'd been when he drifted off. Head lowered, one ear turned toward the door, as though listening for something only wild creatures could hear. The yearling pressed into her side, its frail breaths stirring little curls of frost along the blanket. Ethan blinked awake, feeling that familiar stiffness crawl up his spine. He took a slow breath, steadied himself, and eased to his feet. Outside the barn door, the storm's voice had changed, no longer the full-throated roar of yesterday, but a low, restless muttering, like someone arguing with themselves across an empty valley. When he stepped outside, the world felt muted, as if the snow had wrapped everything in thick cotton. Only his own footprints from the night before remained, half filled with drift, pointing back toward the house like evidence of a man who had made a decision he still wasn't sure he understood. He scattered feed for the cattle and checked the frozen pump line. Every movement felt automatic, the well-worn routine of a life built on chores rather than conversation. But even as he worked, his mind drifted back toward the barn, toward the mare's eyes, toward the quiet trust that had slipped between them sometime near midnight. Something about it tugged at him, the way an old memory sometimes tugs when you're trying hard not to remember it. By the time he trudged back through the drifted path, wind nibbling at the edges of his coat, the valley felt different. Not safer. Just less empty. Ethan brushed snow from his shoulders and pushed open the barn door. Warm breath rolled toward him, horse breath, smelling faintly of hay and earth. He used to love that smell. He'd spent whole summers as a boy sleeping in this barn loft, memorizing the rhythm of horses shifting below him. He'd forgotten how much he missed it until now. The mare lifted her head as he approached. Not startled, not afraid. Just watching him with the steady patience of something that had spent its whole life learning when to run and when to stay. Ethan crouched beside her and gently lifted the edge of the blanket. Steam rose from her coat, and for the first time he let his hands follow the line of her ribs without rushing. Beneath the skin, he felt more than hunger. He felt tension, the kind of tightness that comes from days, maybe weeks, spent running without rest. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, thumb brushing the tender spot beneath her mane. She didn't answer, of course, but the way she closed her eyes made him think she understood the question. Or maybe she understood the quiet apology he hadn't spoken yet. The yearling shifted with a soft grunt, its bandaged leg refusing to bear weight. Ethan checked the swelling again. Still warm, but not hotter than last night. A small relief. He tightened the wrap and murmured reassurance that surprised even him. He hadn't spoken this softly to anything in a long time. When he finally straightened, he felt eyes on him. Human eyes. Not equine. He turned sharply. Bo growled once, deep in his chest. A figure stood just beyond the barn door, bundled in a heavy parka, snow clinging to the hood. For a moment, Ethan's pulse kicked hard. He thought of rope marks, of trailers moving down the valley road at night, the quiet rumors Jed had mentioned. But then the figure lifted a gloved hand. "Morning," a woman's voice called, carrying strangely clear across the cold air. She stepped inside, pushed back her hood, and shook off a crust of snow. She was younger than he'd expected. Mid-30s, maybe, cheeks flushed from the cold, eyes bright and sharp as flint. A small radio unit hung from her shoulder strap. "I'm Dr. Maren Holt," she said. "I'm looking for 2 missing Mustangs. I tracked their last signal to somewhere close to your land." Ethan's jaw tensed. He wasn't used to visitors, let alone strangers with radios and questions. Bo planted himself between them, stiff-legged, tail low. Maren didn't approach him. She approached the horses. Slowly, respectfully. The mare lifted her head higher, ears pricked, body poised between caution and curiosity. Maren paused just a few feet away, letting the mare take her measure. "Easy, girl," she whispered. "You're far from where you should be, aren't you?" Her voice wasn't sweet, but steady. The voice of someone who had spoken to frightened animals often enough to know when to keep quiet and when to keep talking. Ethan found himself watching her more closely than he meant to. She crouched slowly, eye level with the yearling, frowning at the swelling, the trembling, the way it leaned against its mother for every ounce of strength. Her breath fogged the cold air. "This one's hurt bad. And that rope burn." Maren looked up at Ethan. "Did you notice it last night?" "I noticed," he said carefully. "Then you know they weren't alone out there." Ethan didn't answer. He didn't have to. The truth hovered between them like a broken branch hanging by a single strip of bark. Maren swept her glove across the mare's neck, careful not to touch the sore spot. "These 2 belong to a herd we've been monitoring. 7 horses total. 3 had trackers. 2 disappeared off our map 2 days ago." She paused, eyes narrowing on the mare's coat. "And they were running when we lost them. Hard." Ethan felt the barn walls closing in, not physically, but with the weight of something he'd stepped into without meaning to. He'd opened his gate last night for 2 half-frozen horses. He hadn't asked where they came from. He hadn't asked who might be coming after them. He'd just acted. Maren stood slowly, brushing straw from her knee. "I know you didn't plan for this," she said, softer now, "but you did the right thing letting them in." Her words settled somewhere between comfort and warning. Bo barked once, sharply. A noise outside, far away, but real, thudded through the snow. Something metallic. Something not belonging to wind or cattle or wild horses. Maren's expression shifted. Alert. Focused. She exchanged a glance with Ethan, and in that unspoken beat, both of them understood. Whatever had driven the horses here wasn't finished, And this quiet valley, his quiet valley, might no longer be the place he thought he knew. For a long moment, neither Ethan nor Maren moved. The sound outside faded into the wind, leaving only the steady rhythm of 3 heartbeats, 2 equine, 1 human, blending with the soft hiss of snow sliding off the barn roof. Bo stood rigid beside Ethan's leg. Every muscle tightened, his gaze locked on the half-open doorway, as if waiting for the world to step through it. But nothing came. Only silence, the kind of silence that makes a man wonder whether he truly heard what he thought he heard. Maren eased a breath out through her nose. "Could have been a truck back on the county road," she murmured, though the slight tremor in her voice said she didn't quite believe it. Sound carries strange in the cold. Ethan nodded, though he didn't entirely believe himself either. The valley was full of tricks, echoes, shifting wind, the way noise ricocheted off snow-packed ridges. But something about that metallic thud had felt deliberate, too heavy to be a falling branch, too distant to be cattle moving through a frozen trough. He glanced toward the horses. The mare hadn't taken her eyes off the door. Her ears pointed forward, her whole body angled protectively around the yearling. Animals didn't doubt their instincts the way people did. When Ethan turned back, Maren was studying him with an expression that mixed caution and curiosity. "You don't get many visitors out here, do you?" He huffed a quiet laugh, one with more weariness than humor. "Not unless something's broken and needs fixing." "Is something broken now?" He didn't answer. Maybe because the answer felt too large for one sentence. Maybe because he wasn't sure. He pushed the barn door fully shut, sliding the wooden beam across the latch, sealing the cold and whatever lingered outside on the other side of the wall. When he turned, Maren's attention had shifted back to the mare, her eyes softening with the kind of tenderness that didn't need words. "I tracked these 2 all the way from the foothills," she said, kneeling down to check the yearling's bandage. "The storm buried their prints after that, but the GPS signal held until last night." She paused, running her gloved fingers over the swollen joint. Something spooked them hard enough to drive them straight through a blizzard. Ethan crouched next to her. The yearling leaned subtly into his presence, as if it remembered the way his hands had steadied its shaking limb hours earlier. That small, instinctive trust tugged at something deep in him, something he hadn't touched since the day he'd knelt in the snow with Daisy's head in his lap. "You mentioned a herd," he said quietly. 7 horses, Maren replied. "A tight-knit group. They've roamed this valley for years. We've watched them through droughts, storms, even wildfires." She paused, brushing straw from her knee. "They don't scatter unless someone makes them scatter." Her meaning hung in the air between them like a curtain of frost. Ethan didn't ask her to clarify. He didn't need to. Those rope marks on the mare's neck said more than either of them wanted to acknowledge out loud. Bo barked once, softly this time, as if reminding them he was listening too. Maren rose to her feet and dusted her gloves together. "I need to report their location to my team. They've been searching non-stop the last 48 hours. She lifted her radio, twisted the dial, and waited for the static to settle into a steady hum. "We're lucky the storm didn't knock all transmissions out." Ethan stepped aside while she moved toward the barn door. She wasn't careless. She didn't open it fully, just cracked it an inch to lift the antenna toward the open sky. Cold air rushed in around her boots. Her breath turned white and fragile. "Base, this is Holt," she called. "I found them. 2 confirmed. Injured juvenile and adult mare. Both alive." Shelter secured. Coordinates transmitting now. A burst of static answered her. Then a faint male voice filtered through, the kind of voice used to bad weather and bad news. She replied with firm, clipped updates, but her tone softened once she finished. She closed the door again, sealing the barn in a thin cocoon of warmth. "They'll reroute a team," she said, lowering the radio. "Might be hours before they get anywhere close. Roads are half buried, and the canyon pass is iced over." She met Ethan's eyes. "We won't be moving these two today." Ethan let out a slow breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief mixed with something heavier. Responsibility. He'd opened his gate, and now what came next was tied to him whether he wanted it or not. "You should come inside," he said after a beat. "Warm up. I'll make coffee." Marin hesitated, glancing back at the horses. "I'd rather stay where I can keep an eye on them." He gestured toward the small room attached to the barn, once used for tool repairs and late-night calving checks. "There's a stove in there. Door stays open. You won't be far." She considered this, then nodded. "All right." They stepped into the side room together. Ethan fed kindling into the old cast-iron stove, sparks blooming like tiny orange fireflies before fading into dark. The smell of warming metal and dry wood crept into the air. Bo lay down near the threshold where he could watch both humans and horses at once. Marin removed her gloves, rubbing her hands together. Without the hood framing her face, Ethan noticed the faint lines at the corners of her eyes. Not age, exactly, but the imprint of long days spent scanning horizons for animals others overlooked. She had the posture of someone who carried urgency lightly, the way a good saddle carries weight without complaint. "You grew up around horses," she said suddenly, studying him with more insight than most strangers dared. "Once. What happened?" He didn't answer at first. He hadn't said the word accident aloud in years. Instead, he shrugged as if it were a small thing, though both of them knew it wasn't. "Life," he said finally, "and winter." Marin didn't push. She just nodded, accepting the shape of his truth without asking for its details. That quiet respect did something to him, eased something that had been clenched tight for longer than he liked to admit. They sat in the soft crackle of the stove for a while. Outside, the wind slid across the barn walls, a long sigh drawn out over the valley. The horses shifted in their stall, their breaths thick and rhythmic. It felt strange, comforting even, to have company in a place built on solitude. Then, just as Ethan began to think the sounds of the morning had settled into something predictable, Marin stiffened. "Did you hear that?" He held his breath. This time there was no mistaking it, the distant echo of an engine, not a truck on the far road, but something closer, closer than anyone had reason to be, something moving slow, like a vehicle choosing its path to avoid being noticed. The mare's ears snapped forward. The yearling whimpered low in its throat. Ethan felt something cold slip down the back of his neck. Not snow, not wind. Something older, sharper, shaped like memory and fear combined. Marin rose to her feet, jaw tightening. "That's not my team." Ethan didn't reach for the door this time. He didn't need to see what was out there to know that the valley, his valley, had shifted again. The horses had come here fleeing something, and whatever that something was, it had just circled closer. He looked at the mare. She looked back at him. And in her dark, steady eyes, Ethan saw the truth he'd been avoiding since the moment he lifted the latch. Opening the gate, had invited more than 2 wild creatures into his barn. It had invited the trouble chasing them. And now that trouble was settling into the snow just beyond the walls, patient as hunger. The sound of that engine hung in the air long after it faded, an aftertaste of danger, leaving a thin metallic edge in the quiet between heartbeats. Ethan stood completely still, hand on the barn's rough doorframe, listening for anything that might break the hush. Nothing came. No tires grinding on ice, no doors slamming, no voices. Just the wind slipping along the eaves like a restless whisper, and the soft shifting of hooves behind him. Beau's hackles slowly lowered, but his eyes never left the direction the sound had come from. Marin was the first to speak. If someone's scaring mustangs out of their range, they might double back. People like that don't care about the cold or trespassing. She rubbed her palms together, not for warmth, but to steady the tremor in her fingers. My team can't reach us for hours. Ethan walked back inside, shutting the door behind him. The mare watched his every step, muscles taut beneath the blanket, ready to shield her injured young if anything else went wrong. The yearling's ears fluttered anxiously, and Ethan crouched beside it, running his palm down the trembling neck in a slow, steady stroke. The contact grounded both of them. We can't keep them here, he said quietly, not looking away from the horses. If someone's out there, they'll see the tracks leading straight to my barn. Marin stiffened. You're thinking of moving them? In this weather? Ethan nodded once. The decision wasn't born of courage. It came from the same subtle instinct that horses trusted in storms. When danger closes in, staying put becomes the riskiest thing a living creature can do. The storm's easing, he continued. If we take the west trail, we can reach the canyon floor before nightfall. It's sheltered. And your team, they can get closer through the lower pass, right? Marin hesitated, then gave a slow nod. It's possible, and safer than waiting. Ethan didn't move for a moment. He just crouched there, feeling the heat of the young horse beneath his hand, remembering too vividly the last time he'd braced a frightened animal and promised it safety. This time, though, he had someone beside him who understood the stakes. Marin stepped closer, her voice dropping into something soft but steady. We do this slow, she said. We let the mare guide the pace, and we keep an eye out for anything that looks like a trail someone else made. Ethan gave a quiet, humorless huff. Out here, everything looks like a trail someone else made. But he stood, rolling his shoulders back, shaking off the weight of the past as best as a man could in the middle of winter. He opened the supply chest, pulling out lengths of rope, an old halter softened by years, and a thick leather strap he'd repaired more times than his own coat. Marin watched him move, reading something in the way he handled the old gear. You said you worked with horses once. A long time ago. You never forget, you know, she murmured. The body remembers, even if the heart doesn't want to. He didn't reply, but he didn't need to. The look he gave her was answer enough. Together, they fashioned a makeshift support harness for the yearling. Nothing tight, nothing restrictive, just enough to steady the injured leg and keep weight off it during the walk. Marin held the young horse's face gently, while Ethan tightened the last knot, her voice whispering through the barn like a warm breeze guiding a trembling flame. When they stepped outside, the cold hit sharp, but not brutal. The sky hung low and heavy, a dull pewter dome that softened the edges of the world. Snow covered everything in a smooth, painterly sweep. The west trail was barely visible now, just a faint depression where drifts hadn't fully swallowed the earth. Ethan whistled low, a soft, steady sound to coax the mare forward. She stepped out first, testing the ground. Her breath came in thick bursts of white, and the yearling leaned against her side as it limped into the winter light. Maren walked beside them, guiding the strap and adjusting the harness whenever the yearling stumbled. Bo trotted ahead, nose low, checking every bend before they reached it. Ethan stayed behind the group, scanning the tree line for anything that didn't belong. Tire ruts, a glint of metal, footprints curved wrong for boots. "When was the last time you took this trail?" Maren asked quietly. "Last winter," Ethan answered. "Took a calf down to Jed's place after it got separated from the herd. Think we'll make it to the canyon floor before night? If the snow stays light." He paused. "And if nothing follows us." Neither of them said the rest aloud. The chumrats. Horses felt it anyway. Their ears flicked backward at every gust of wind, every shifting shadow. Instinct pricked at Ethan's skin, the same way it had when he'd lost Daisy. Back then, he'd ignored the unease and paid the price. Today, he wouldn't. As they descended the first gentle slope of the West Trail, the valley opened in front of them, a long ribbon of white stretching toward distant trees. There was beauty in it, stark and quiet. The kind of beauty a man only noticed if he'd ever lost something to the cold. Maren slowed as the yearling faltered. Ethan moved to her side, brushing frost from the harness. "Easy," he whispered to the creature. "Just keep leaning into her. She won't let you fall." The yearling steadied. The mare huffed softly, touching her muzzle to Ethan's jacket sleeve. It was the smallest gesture, barely more than a brush of warm breath. But it carried gratitude. Trust. A thread tying their 3 fragile lives together as the valley exhaled cold around them. They walked for a long while without speaking. Snow creaked under their boots. The horses' hooves left faint crescents in the untouched powder. The trail narrowed where pines crowded close, their branches bending low under icy weight. For a moment, the world felt almost peaceful, like the danger behind them had been swallowed whole by the morning light. But then they reached the clearing. Ethan stopped so abruptly that Maren nearly walked into him. His breath clouded in front of him, hanging heavy and still. A set of tracks crossed the trail ahead. Deep, fresh, unmistakable. Not wildlife, not rancher, not anyone who had a right to be here. The tread was from a heavy-duty vehicle, one built to handle rough terrain. The kind poachers favored when the land was too frozen for horses and too steep for trucks. The mare froze. The yearling pressed against her, terrified by her fear. Maren whispered, "They're close." Ethan looked at the trail, then at the horses, then at the narrowing valley ahead. "We keep moving," he said, his voice quiet, steady, unshakably certain. "We don't stop now." The wind picked up, swirling snow across the tracks. Within minutes, the trail ahead would look untouched again. But they had seen enough to understand the truth. Someone else was on the frozen road west, and they weren't headed away. They were circling in. The day dimmed faster than either of them expected. Winter has a way of stealing light before a person is ready to let it go, and on the west trail that evening, it slipped from the sky like a door quietly closing. The pines darkened to ink. The snow turned from white to blue-gray. Even the horse's breath, once bright in the cold air, faded into thin ribbons barely visible against the dusk. Ethan kept a steady pace, his boots sinking into the deepening drifts, every muscle remembering the urgency he didn't want to speak aloud. Maren walked beside the yearling, adjusting the harness each time the young horse stumbled. Bo scouted ahead, a silent shadow weaving between trees. They had reached the long bend of the trail, a part of the valley rarely used in winter, when the temperature dropped sharply, the kind of drop that warned of a new storm rolling in behind the hills. Ethan felt the shift instantly, a pinching cold that slid beneath the collar of his coat and settled in his chest. He stopped. Looked up. The sky had lost shape. No moon, no break in the clouds, just a dark heaviness gathering above the treetops. "We need shelter," he murmured. Marin looked around, breath quivering in the fading light. "Where?" "There's nothing out here except—" Ethan pointed through the trees, a slanted roofline barely visible under a heavy cloak of snow. "Old calving shed. My father used it years ago. Half collapsed by now, but it's better than staying on the trail." The mare seemed to understand before Marin did. She nudged the yearling forward, as if urging it to move before the storm arrived. Snowflakes had begun drifting down, slow, soft, almost gentle, but Ethan knew their softness wouldn't last. A storm often begins like a whisper before it decides to scream. Getting the horses into the shed took longer than expected. The doorway was partly blocked by a drift, the roof sagged in the middle, and the floor was uneven, warped boards and old straw frozen into brittle layers. Ethan swept the worst of the snow aside with his arm, letting the mare step through first. Inside, the shed smelled of cedar and dust, the faint memory of animals long gone. The wind hissed through cracks in the walls, threading itself between the boards like a cold breath. But it was shelter. Imperfect. Leaning, fragile, but shelter all the same. The mare stood near the back wall, lowering her head so the yearling could lean against her. Ethan untied the harness and checked the bandage again. The swelling hadn't worsened, but the young horse's trembling had deepened, each quiver running through its muscles like waves. Marin knelt beside it, her hands steady despite the icy air gnawing at her fingers. She murmured words too quiet for Ethan to catch, but the tone was a balm in itself. Calm, patient, warm. "Storm's coming fast," Ethan said, trying to mask the tightness in his voice. "It won't last long," Marin answered, though she didn't sound certain. "But we can't move them until morning." Ethan nodded. He moved to the doorway and pushed a pile of snow inward to block more wind. The shed groaned under a sudden gust, the old wood bowing like a tired rib cage. Bo curled near the entrance, ears twitching at every sound outside. The valley had grown unnervingly still, as if the world were holding its breath. Inside the dim shed, lantern light painted the horses in warm gold. Ethan sank onto an overturned crate, rubbing his hands together. He glanced at Marin, who sat cross-legged near the mare's flank, shoulders hunched in. Quiet focus. In the flickering glow, her face had the softness of someone who'd spent years tending wounds that didn't belong to her, trying to mend the parts of the world that didn't know how to heal themselves. "You do this often?" Ethan asked, voice low. "More than you'd think," she replied. "Most people don't see what happens to wild horses. They see beauty, freedom. But freedom's fragile. Sometimes all it takes is the wrong kind of person, in the wrong kind of truck, at the wrong time of day." She trailed off. Her gaze had drifted toward the mare's rope burn. Ethan followed it. The sight tightened his throat again. "They'll come looking for them," Ethan said. "Whoever chased them off the ridge." Marin didn't deny it. "We'll get them to my team before that happens." A gust slammed into the shed, rattling loose boards. Snow sprayed through the cracks like white dust. The mare flinched, but didn't move from her position, shielding the yearling. Ethan stood, bracing a hand against the wall. "This place won't hold," he muttered. It only needs to hold through tonight, Marin replied. Just one night. But even one night felt like a long promise to make in a valley where weather rarely kept its word. Ethan grabbed an old tarp from the corner and pinned it over the worst of the gaps using rusty nails he found frozen to the wall. Marin helped him stretch it tight. Bo settled again, nose pressed to the door seam, sensing every shift in the storm outside. When they finished, Ethan sank back onto the crate. A long silence settled between them. Not awkward, not heavy, just the kind of silence shared by people who had run out of small words and were now working with the large ones, the ones that don't need to be spoken. The shed creaked again. Snow thudded against the roof in rhythmic pulses, like a distant heartbeat. The yearling let out a soft sound, barely audible, and Marin reached out, resting her palm lightly on its withers. We'll get you there, she whispered. Just hold on. Ethan watched her, watched the mare's steady breath, watched flakes swirling through the lantern beam at the doorway. For a moment, he felt the strange warmth of a life he'd almost forgotten. A life filled with purpose that wasn't measured in bills or insurance forms or the quiet ache of living alone for too many winters. He heard himself say, without planning to, "Thank you for coming when you did." Marin looked up. "You're the one who opened the gate." "Sometimes that's the easy part," Ethan murmured. "It's everything after that." Her expression softened, something understanding passing quietly between them. Outside, the storm gathered force, wind curling around the shed like cold fingers searching for a way in. But inside, the small circle of light felt stubbornly alive. 3 humans, 2 wild horses, 1 dog, and a shared determination to outlast whatever waited in the darkness. The shed groaned again, louder this time. Ethan rose instinctively, steadying a slanted support beam. Snow whipped across the doorway, as if testing their resolve. Marin stood too. "If it gets worse, we brace it together." Ethan nodded, placing his palm flat against the trembling wood. "We will." The lantern flickered. The horses breathed in rhythm. Bo pressed closer to Ethan's boot, and the night closed around them, thick and white and unforgiving. But they stayed, and the shed stayed, and between the rattling boards and drifting snow, a quiet truth settled deeper than the cold. They weren't running anymore. They were enduring. Together. Dawn arrived like a hesitant apology, soft, pale, unsure if it had the right to return after a night so heavy. The storm had spent itself in the small hours, leaving behind a strange stillness that made every sound feel louder than it should. When Ethan pushed open the shed door, the hinges groaned, and the noise carried across the valley, as if the land itself had been waiting for a sign that the living were still here. The air was bitter but clear. His breath rose in steady clouds, and for the first time since sunrise the previous morning, the sky showed a thin seam of gold along the horizon. The mare stepped forward, ears pricked, testing the morning. She no longer trembled the way she had last night, though her ribs still shifted sharply with each inhale. The yearling leaned against her flank, its injured leg tense, but not as swollen. Marin knelt beside it, running her fingers gently over the bandage, her face still shadowed with the remnants of a sleepless night. "It held together," she murmured, more to herself than to Ethan. "That's something." "Something's better than nothing," he replied. But his eyes were on the trees. The storm had erased most of the tracks from yesterday, but the memory of the tire marks, of the presence hunting these horses, remained carved into his mind, even if the snow had smoothed them away. Bo trotted ahead, nose to the ground. At first, Ethan thought the dog was simply stretching his legs, but then the old mutt froze, tail straight, ears tilted forward. A warning posture, not fear, alertness. "What is it, boy?" Ethan whispered. Bo didn't move. The mare lifted her head. Her entire body tightened, muscles bracing not for danger, but for recognition. She made a low sound, a soft, trembling call buried halfway between hope and dread. The yearling answered instinctively, a weak, high whinny that echoed through the cold air like a question searching for its missing half. Ethan followed their gaze. At first he saw nothing, just the tree line, a thick wall of dark pines shaking the last of the storm's powder from their branches. But then a shape emerged, almost indistinguishable from the forest itself. A figure stepped from the shadows, slow and uneven. A horse, but not like the mare or the yearling. This one looked carved out, of winter's harshest edges, thin to the bone, coat matted, flank trembling from exhaustion. Snow clung to its sides like frost on dying embers. One front leg barely touched the ground, the pastern swollen to nearly twice its natural size. Its head hung low, bony and sharp, but its eyes burned with a stubborn brightness that didn't belong to something already half-finished by the cold. Marin's breath hitched. "Oh my God, that's a stallion. Young. Maybe 3 years. "Ash," Ethan murmured, without knowing why the name fit so naturally. He took a slow step toward it, hand raised, palm open. That must be the third. The mare called again, louder this time, not pleading, commanding. A mother calling her lost child home. The lone horse flicked an ear, then another, then finally lifted its head enough for the morning light to touch its face. There was no mistaking the connection. Something in its posture softened at the sound of the mare's voice, its entire weight tipping toward her without thought or caution. But when it stepped forward, its injured leg buckled, and it nearly collapsed. Marin moved first. "Easy, easy." She approached slowly, every line of her body signaling calm. Ethan circled wide, cutting off the stallion's potential escape route, not to trap him, but to keep him from panicking and hurting himself worse. The stallion took another trembling step, then another. The mare came forward to meet him, brushing her muzzle against his cheek. The yearling let out a soft cry, and the stallion nudged it with a fragile tenderness that nearly split Ethan in two. 3 bodies, broken in different ways, leaning into each other as if relearning the shape of belonging. "Family," Marin whispered. "This is a family unit." The wind settled. Even the valley seemed to quiet, as though witnessing something sacred. Ethan stepped closer. The stallion watched him, eyes shimmering with the wary intelligence only wild horses carry. Trust and fear warred in its gaze. But when Ethan reached out a hand, it didn't retreat. It didn't fight. It simply stood there, trembling, letting him touch the dirty, half-frozen strands of its mane. "Good boy," Ethan murmured. "You made it." Up close, the damage was worse than he expected. Rope burns. Deep ones, bruising along the chest. A cut near the hock that had frozen shut. His jaw tightened. Anger mixing with a familiar helplessness. That same helplessness he'd felt kneeling in the snow the day Daisy took her last breath. Only this time, there was still a chance to change the ending. "We need to warm him," Maren said. "Slowly. And we need to support that leg before it collapses completely." "Then we'd better get him inside," Ethan said. "He's not going to make it far." The stallion swayed again. The mare pressed her body against his side, steadying him. The yearling limped closer, their 3 breaths intertwining in small, foggy bursts. Ethan swallowed hard. "We're not going back to the shed. Too unstable." He pointed toward a cluster of trees. "There's a hollow near the ridge. Natural windbreak. We use the tarps, build a barrier, and settle them in there until your team arrives." "It'll take time," Maren said. "And he might collapse on the way. Then we catch him." And so they began the slow, painstaking work of moving the broken family toward safety. Step by fragile step. Ethan and Maren on either side, guiding, steadying, whispering reassurance into the cold air. Bo flanked the group, checking the path ahead with unwavering vigilance. As they approached the hollow, a faint rumble drifted across the valley, too distant to locate, too heavy to ignore. Maren froze. Ethan lifted his head. The mare's ears shot forward. Another engine. Not the wind, not imagination, not friendly. The stallion stumbled, nearly falling. Ethan grabbed the leather strap, holding him upright. "Just a little farther," he whispered, voice cracking. "Please, just a little more." The horses pressed on, driven not by fear now, but by hope, by reunion, by instinct. When they finally reached the hollow, the stallion collapsed into the snow with a soft, broken groan, too tired to hold up his own weight anymore. The mare stood over him. The yearling nudged his neck. Ethan dropped to his knees beside them. Maren knelt on the other side. For a moment, the world went perfectly still. 3 horses, barely clinging to warmth. 2 humans, carrying more than their share of ghosts. 1 valley, holding its breath. And somewhere beyond the trees, the sound of an engine was growing louder. For a moment after the stallion collapsed, Ethan felt the world narrow to a single point. The soft thud of Ash's body sinking into the snow. It wasn't the sound of defeat, but the sound of something that had run farther than its strength should have allowed. The mare lowered her head, touching her muzzle to his cheek in a gesture so tender it almost hurt to watch. The yearling pressed in close, too, trembling but determined, as if trying to lend its own thin warmth to a creature who had given up every last ounce of his. Maren knelt on Ash's other side, breath clouding in front of her. "We need to keep him conscious," she murmured. "If he falls asleep like this, his body temperature will drop too fast." Ethan nodded, sliding his hand down the stallion's neck. The mane was stiff with ice, the strands brittle. Ash's chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths, each one a small victory. Ethan leaned closer, speaking in that soft, steady tone he hadn't used in years. Not since Daisy. "Stay with us, boy. You're here now. You made it to them. Don't stop now." The mare lifted her head at the sound of Ethan's voice, her eyes dark and wide. She stepped forward, pressing her shoulder into his as if urging him to keep going. That small weight, warm, real, trusting, steadied him in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. Together, they worked quickly. Ethan and Maren dragged the tarps into place, anchoring them with branches and snow-packed edges to create a windbreak inside the hollow. It wasn't pretty, and it certainly wasn't strong, but it shielded them from the worst of the cold. They spread old blankets beneath Ash, lifting him just enough so that the chill ground wouldn't steal the rest of his strength. The mare stayed close, her breath washing over Ash's neck. The yearling curled beside him, head resting on his shoulder. For a moment, nothing in the valley moved except the slow rise and fall of 3 fragile chests, creatures tied together by something older and deeper than fear. Family wasn't a concept horses pondered. They simply lived it. They bled for it. They returned to it even when the world tried to tear them apart. Bo sat at the entrance of the hollow, ears pointed outward. Guarding. Quiet. A sentinel carved of fur and devotion. Maren exhaled hard, rubbing her hands together. If we can get him stable for the next hour, he has a chance. But if that engine comes any closer... She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Ethan heard the unspoken truth in her voice. He looked out into the trees. The wind had begun to pick up again, carrying the faint smell of frost and something else. Something metallic, artificial, unwanted. Tracks erased by the night's storm didn't change the fact that someone had been out there. Someone persistent enough to keep searching. "We'll handle it," Ethan said, surprising himself with the firmness in his tone. Right now, he needs to stay warm. He tore open the supply pack. Inside were the remnants of what he used last night. Salve, wraps, a small tin of warm water he'd tucked against his body during the hike. Maren reached for the wraps first, her movements efficient and sure. She braced Ash's leg and began to adjust the original bandaging, eyes narrowing as she traced the cluster of bruises just above the joint. "He didn't get this from falling," she whispered. "Someone tied him. Hard." Ethan swallowed. The anger that rose in him wasn't the hot, reckless kind. It was deep, cold, steady. The kind that made a man choose carefully instead of lash out. He held the stallion's head gently between his palms as Maren worked. Ash's eyes opened slightly, one brown clear despite the exhaustion. Ethan kept whispering, letting the horse hear the steadiness in his voice. "You're safe. They can't get to you here. Not while we're with you." The mare stepped closer at those words, brushing her forehead against Ethan's shoulder. It wasn't a gesture horses gave to strangers. It was something reserved for those they considered part of their circle. Their circle. The word hung in his mind as he felt the warmth of the mare's breath through his coat. He hadn't been part of any circle, human or otherwise, in longer than he liked to admit. Maren looked up at the 3 of them, her expression softening. "You know, it's rare to see a family unit reunite like this, especially after trauma. They usually scatter until they're sure the danger's gone." "Not these 3, Ethan said. "They've been trying to reach each other through the whole storm." "Because they know what they stand to lose," she replied quietly. The wind shifted, sending a swirl of loose snow drifting through the hollow. Ash shivered, and Ethan draped another tarp across the entrance, leaving only a narrow gap for air. Maren wrapped her arms around herself to keep the cold at bay, but her eyes never left the horses. Time stretched in that strange winter silence, long, slow breaths, faint rustles of snow slipping off branches above them, the soft, rhythmic sound of Ash's labored breathing. The mare groomed him gently, pulling ice from his mane. The yearling shifted closer, tucking its small frame against his ribs. The 3 of them formed a circle, leaning, supporting, protecting, and Ethan knew that whatever bonded them was something beyond survival. It was love in its rawest, simplest form. A distant echo broke the peace. A low, grinding engine, Closer this time. Not a truck on the road. Not a ranger vehicle. Something creeping through the trees. Searching. Marin's eyes snapped to Ethan. "That's not my team." Bo growled, a low rumble vibrating through the hollow. Ethan stood, snow clinging to his coat. "Stay with them," he said. His voice was calm in the way a winter sky looks calm before breaking open. "I'll look." Marin rose too. "You won't go alone." "I know." He hesitated. "But someone has to stay with the horses. They trust you." Her expression wavered, but only for a heartbeat. Then she nodded, placing a gentle hand on the mare's withers. "Be careful." Ethan stepped to the hollow's edge and peered into the dark forest. The sound of the engine pulsed faintly between the trees. Closer. Too close. Snow drifted off the branches in soft cascades, masking footprints, dampening noise. The valley around them felt like a giant lung holding its breath. Behind him, the horses huddled closer together, their circle tight, unbroken. As Ethan moved toward the tree line, he realized something with painful clarity. These 3 fragile lives were no longer just mustangs to him. They were the last remains of something he'd thought he'd lost forever. The instinct to protect, to fight, to believe that saving something still mattered. And no one, not the storm, not the cold, not whatever machine crawled through the valley, was going to take them away again. The engine's echo thinned into the trees, dissolving into the hush that follows danger. Not safety, just a pause long enough to feel its weight. Ethan stood between 2 pines, breath held just short of frost, listening for the next sign of whoever was out there. The air seemed to tighten, shrinking around him until even the sound of snow settling felt like a warning. He waited, counting the seconds, letting the valley speak in its strange winter language, but the sound did not return. Whoever had come this far had stopped, or turned, or, more unsettling, chosen silence over distance. He stayed there until the cold began biting through his coat. Only then did he turn back toward the hollow, toward the cluster of warmth he'd left behind. As he approached, he saw Marin kneeling beside Ash with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, coaxing the stallion to take slow, steady breaths. The mare hovered protectively, her head brushing Marin's arm in a gesture so trusting it almost didn't belong in a world where cruelty had chased these horses halfway across the valley. Ethan stepped into the circle of lamplight spilling from the tarp wall, the glow softening the lines of exhaustion on Marin's face. "Anything?" she asked. No movement, no voices, just the quiet. Marin nodded, though worry carved a deeper line between her brows. Quiet can be worse than noise. It can. Ethan lowered himself beside Ash again, letting his knees sink into the snow. But we can't let it freeze us in place. The stallion shifted, his breathing still shallow but less erratic than before. Ethan reached out and rested a hand on the young horse's neck. The heat was faint, but present. Better than the chill that had taken him earlier. If Ash could hold on just a little longer, daylight would do the rest. They only needed the sun to rise enough to wake the valley back into motion, enough for Marin's team to reach them. The mare stepped closer to Ethan, brushing his sleeve with her warm breath. He let his fingers drift up the ridge of her cheek, feeling the slight tremor beneath her skin. She wasn't afraid. She was waiting. All 3 of them were waiting. Bo circled the hollow's entrance once, twice, then lay down with a heavy sigh, head pointed toward the trees, as if telling the night he had no intention of letting it come any nearer. "We need a plan," Marin whispered. "Not just for them. For us." Ethan nodded. At first light, we move toward the canyon floor. Your team can reach us faster down there. You're sure he can walk? She nodded toward Ash. He doesn't need to walk far, just far enough. Marin's shoulders rounded a little, exhaustion lowering her guard. I hate that this valley feels like a battlefield all of a sudden. Ethan looked out at the snow-covered trees, each one frozen in place like a line of quiet soldiers. Everything feels like a battlefield when you realize what you could lose. For a moment, neither spoke. The hollow breathed with them. Soft, warm, fragile. Snow tapped against the tarp overhead, the faintest rhythm of winter. The lantern flickered, casting slow-moving shadows across the horses' bodies. Time stretched thin, and the valley listened. Marin turned toward him. You've been on one, haven't you? Ethan didn't answer. Not immediately. But she wasn't guessing. She was seeing something in the way he held himself, something learned the hard way. He exhaled, the breath long and worn. Life has its wars, he murmured, some louder than others. She didn't ask for more. He appreciated that. Some truths live better in silence. Ash stirred. Not a collapse, not a panic, just the faintest attempt to lift his head. The mare nickered softly, encouraging him. The yearling nudged his shoulder, its voice trembling but hopeful. Something flickered in Ash's eyes, thin as dawn, stubborn as survival. That's it, Ethan whispered. Come back to us. Marin placed a hand on the stallion's flank. He's fighting. He's not the only one. Ethan's voice cracked in a way he didn't try to hide. They kept moving through a storm, through fear, through pain, just to get back to each other. Marin's gaze met his, soft but steady. That's what families do. And something in him opened at that, something he'd sealed shut the day Daisy died. A recognition. A memory. A truth he'd been avoiding for too long. Before Ethan could say more, a faint crack echoed through the trees. A branch breaking. Snow shifting. Something moving beyond sight. Bo shot to his feet with a low growl. Ethan stood fast, heart slamming once against his ribs. But the forest did not reveal anything. No shape. No voice. Only quiet. Heavy, deliberate quiet. Marin's breath fluttered. They're close. They must be circling. Ethan stepped forward, blocking the hollow's entrance, body angled as if his presence alone could turn back whatever stalked the darkness. We won't let them come near these horses. Marin rose too. We're not leaving them. He turned slightly, enough to look at her. Really look at her, standing there with snow tangled in her hair, face drawn with fatigue, but eyes fierce with conviction. She wasn't just a vet. She wasn't just here because her trackers led her. She was here because she refused to abandon creatures that the world had decided were expendable. You're braver than you look, he said softly. So are you, she replied. Snow began falling again, thin flakes drifting down like ash from a dying fire. The world seemed to dim under it, not with darkness, but with the strange quiet of winter mornings that haven't yet chosen what kind of day they want to be. Ash exhaled a long, steady breath. Then another. His chest began to rise stronger. The mare shifted her weight, leaning into him with the gentlest pressure. The yearling curled closer, its eyes half-lidded but calm. Marin crouched beside them again. Her smile was small, tired, but real. They're stable enough to move at first light. Ethan nodded. Then at dawn, we walk. Outside the hollow, far off in the trees, something moved, a distant hum, like a vehicle turning over, then stopping. Not leaving. Waiting. But Ethan didn't flinch this time. Neither did Marin. Neither did the horses. They had formed their own circle now, 6 living beings bound not by fear, but by a fragile, stubborn hope that refused to break. They would cross the valley at dawn. They would reach the canyon floor. They would outrun whatever hunted them. And they would do it together. The hollow settled into silence again, but it was no longer the silence of danger. It was the silence before courage. Dawn crept into the hollow with the quiet restraint of someone afraid to disturb the wounded. A pale band of light stretched across the snow, soft and slow, touching the mare first, glinting on the frost along her mane. Then the yearling, curled at her side, and finally Ash, who lifted his head with a trembling determination that made Ethan's breath catch in his chest. Morning had always been a fragile thing in this valley, but today it felt like a promise. A small, stubborn promise that something broken might still be carried forward. Marin was already awake, brushing the stallion's shoulder with slow, even strokes. Her face was tired, but not defeated. She met Ethan's eyes as he rose from where he'd slept against the tarp wall, and there was something new there. Gratitude, relief, and a quiet acknowledgement of the night they'd endured together. "He's ready," she whispered. "Weak, but ready." Ethan crouched beside Ash, placing a steady hand against the horse's neck. The warmth beneath his palm, thin but alive, felt like the first step of a long walk home. "We move slow," he murmured, "and we don't look back." The words weren't for Ash alone. They were for himself. The mare nudged the yearling to its feet. The young horse wobbled, but stood. The stallion followed suit, swaying once before finding balance. 3 battered survivors, standing in the faint glow of morning, framed by snow-dusted branches and a world waiting just beyond the hollow. Bo barked once, quiet, insistent, signaling the path was clear. Ethan stepped out first, brushing snow from his coat. The cold air bit at his face, sharper than the night before, but the sky above was softening to a gentle winter blue. No engine, no voices, just the hush of a valley waking from a long storm. "Stay close," Marin said, looping the support strap around the yearling once more. "If his leg gives out—" "I've got him," Ethan replied. They moved together, slow but steady, forming a small procession of breath and hope against the morning chill. The snow crunched beneath their boots and hooves. The trees parted gradually, revealing a long descent toward the canyon floor where Marin's team would meet them. The way was steep in places, narrow in others, but the valley seemed to open before them, as though recognizing their fragile courage and granting them safe passage. Ash faltered once, his legs buckling beneath him. Ethan pressed a shoulder under the stallion's ribs, steadying him. Marin touched Ash's muzzle, whispering encouragement. The mare responded too, brushing her body against his to share her warmth. And somehow, together, they kept moving. Halfway down the slope, the wind shifted. A sound drifted across the valley, thin, distant, deliberate. Ethan froze. Marin stiffened beside him. A hum. A mechanical hum. Not the storm. Not the wind. The engine. Bo growled deep in his throat. The horses lifted their heads, muscles tightening in instinctive fear. But the sound didn't draw closer. It remained at the valley's northern edge, circling, then growing fainter. The storm had covered their tracks well, and God, or something like him, had given them this morning without confrontation. "Keep going," Ethan said, voice steady now. "We're almost there." As they reached the last ridge, the valley widened like an open hand. In the distance, they saw movement, 2 bright jackets, a radio antenna, and a truck fitted with wide snow treads. Maren exhaled in a rush that sounded like relief and fear leaving her all at once. "They found us," she whispered. "They actually found us." The mare lifted her head high, as if sensing the safety ahead. The yearling limped forward, leaning into its mother. Ash walked with trembling pride, refusing to rest until he reached the bottom. When they arrived, the rescue team moved quietly, respectfully, as if aware of the fragile miracle before them. A ramp was lowered. Warm blankets draped over trembling bodies. Gentle hands, soft voices. Ethan stepped back, letting the professionals work. But the horses didn't step away from him. Not yet. Ash turned his head, nudging Ethan's chest with a slow, grateful pressure. The mare followed, brushing her muzzle against his sleeve one last time. Maren watched, her expression softening. "They know," she said. "They know who opened the gate." Ethan swallowed hard. "I didn't do it alone." "You did the hardest part," Maren replied. "You chose not to look away." He didn't answer. He couldn't. The truth of her words sank deeper than the cold ever could. The yearling was loaded first, then Ash, with great care, his injured leg supported by 2 handlers, and finally the mare, who looked back at Ethan through the open door, her dark eyes carrying a last message he understood without needing language. "Thank you. We made it. Let us go now." The door closed gently. A week later, when Maren's letter arrived in his mailbox, creased from travel, softened by gloves that cared more about animals than paperwork, Ethan stood on his porch for a long time before opening it. Bo sat at his feet, tail sweeping the snow. Inside were photographs, 3 horses standing beneath a clear winter sun. The yearling stronger. Ash alert, his coat brushed clean. The mare, proud and steady, her scars healing into faint, pale lines. A reminder of what they survived. And a final note, written in Maren's clean, careful handwriting. "Release day, they'll run again. Thought you should be there." Ethan closed the letter carefully. Then he looked out across Paradise Valley, the same valley that had held his grief, his solitude, his unspoken memories. And for the first time in years, it didn't feel heavy. It felt open, as if something in it had exhaled. He saddled the old snowmobile and headed north. Bo rode beside him, nose high to catch the wind. The sky stretched wide, endless. Somewhere ahead, 3 Mustangs waited for their freedom. When he reached the release site, he stood with Maren and the others, watching as the ramp lowered. The horses stepped out, first the mare, then the yearling, then Ash, into a world washed in pale light. They paused only a moment before trotting toward the rolling rise of the land. At the ridge, the mare turned. She walked back a few steps and stopped directly before Ethan. The world went quiet, as if gathering around this single heartbeat. She lifted her head and touched her muzzle lightly to his shoulder. One breath, warm and steady. A goodbye and a blessing in the same gesture. Then she turned, gathered her family close, and galloped into the open white. 3 dark shapes dissolving into distance, into wind, into something beyond grief. Ethan didn't wave. He didn't call out. He simply watched them until they disappeared over the horizon, carried not by fear now, but by freedom. And when the valley swallowed their silhouettes, he felt something inside him loosen, something he'd held tight for too many winters. Loss no longer felt like an ending. It felt like a place you passed through on your way to something else. Beside him, Marin whispered, "They made it." Ethan nodded, eyes still following the empty horizon. So did we. A soft breeze brushed the snow, shifting the light. The sound of hooves had faded, but their echo lingered, not in fear, but in memory. And the valley, for the first time in a long while, felt like home again. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Just share a simple comment or a few words below. And if you want more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. Your support helps these quiet, truthful moments find their way to more people. I hope you'll join me for the next story.